Welcome to our webinar at Home with Stephen Naifeh. Before we begin, I have a few administrative matters. We have put you all on mute, so please remain muted during the whole presentation and unmute yourself at the end if you want to participate and ask some questions. We are extremely happy to have today an intimate conversation with Stephen Naifeh, who is a unique and inspiring figure in the art world. He is a successful writer, artist, and art collector. We are very privileged tonight as Stephen will be taking us on an exclusive virtual tour of a small part of his private collection. The discovery of his captivating artistic journey will be moderated by Vincent Larnicole. Stephen Naifeh is a graduate of Harvard Law School. He studied art history at Princeton and Harvard Fogg Art Museum. He is the author of several books, including 2 Pulitzer Prize winning American biographers of both Vincent van Gogh and Jackson Pollock. Stephen is also an artist whose geometric abstraction works have been exhibited in numerous museums throughout the world. Dear Stephen, we are thrilled to have been able to organize this discussion tonight, knowing that you have a special link with the region. I know how much you love Abu Dhabi and the people of this country, and it's a real honor for the Art Circle to have you with us tonight. Now I will leave the floor to Vincent.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Should I say good morning to you, Stephen? What time is it for you now? We need to have you on mute. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. Yes. Oh, almost there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect, Stephen. What time is it for you now?
It's 10 o'clock in the morning.
And where are you? I think you're in the US, correct?
Yes, I am in South Carolina in the American South, where I've lived for about 30 years now.
Right.
And I want to thank you all and the Art Circle and the other organization for inviting me to participate in this program. And as you say, I have a long and abiding love for Abu Dhabi. So this is a real pleasure for me.
Stephen, we're very happy, and actually I would like to launch you on that. When I was, we were talking about the preparation of this talk today, obviously I looked at your biography. I felt very connected to your biography because it looks like we have lived in almost same countries, you and I was very excited that you spent some time, obviously, in the Middle East, but also in North Africa, in Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, your life is almost like a Lawrence of Arabia kind of a life. So before we talk to you about you as an artist, where have you been in this region, and what is your connection with this region?
Well, my original connection is that my family comes from the region. My father's mother came to the United States from what is now Lebanon, and his father came to the United States from what is now Jordan. So on my father's side of the family, I am Arab, and but I'm actually closer to the Arab world than, say, most of my relatives here in America, because my father joined the Foreign Service. So I was born in the Middle East, and I lived in a whole group of Arab and Islamic countries, including Iraq, Libya, Jordan, Abu Dhabi, Oman, Nigeria, which has a substantial Muslim population, Pakistan, which of course is Muslim. So I spent most of my life going to school in America after a certain point, but living with my parents in the Middle East. So the connection is quite strong. My parents both, I unfortunately had a little bit of Arabic training as a child, but it didn't really, I wish I spoke it better. Both my mother and my father spoke it extremely well. And my mother actually taught at a girls' school in Abu Dhabi called Mar. They were there for 4 years, and it was one of their, if not their happiest assignment. So the connection is both ethnic, because I am Arab, and geographic, because I lived all over the Middle East in the Arab and Muslim world. As you mentioned, Libya was one of those countries, and I sort of became an artist in Libya because we were in a very small town that was the capital of Libya back then, and one of the people in that city was an artist, and interestingly, she was from Holland, and we talked about Van Gogh a lot. I had no idea that that would have an influence on me later. But those were, when you're a child, you absorb a lot. And so to study with this woman when I was 9 and 10 years old was very important. But of course, I was also assimilating the lessons about the glories of Islamic art going back a millennium. Because in addition to the places we lived, we traveled elsewhere. We traveled to Egypt and we traveled to Syria, and we saw the glories of Muslim architecture and the glories of Muslim calligraphy and of Muslim painting. And so all that was in me, especially the geometry that is at the core of so much Islamic architecture. And so even when I was about 15, without a sort of thinking of a program, I began to combine the lessons of Islamic geometry with the practice of geometric abstraction in much of the West, especially in America and in England. And I stopped working for a while to work on the books, but I began maybe 20 years ago to start painting again. And at that point, the synergy between Islamic geometric abstraction and Western geometric abstraction became very clear to me. And I began to make works like this one here, which is sort of equally, the pattern is a traditional Islamic one, but the sense of a shaped canvas and the sort of optical illusions come from Western art. So it really is a complete synergy between the two different worlds. And I have,
Stephen, if you,
yes,
if you allow
Vincent,
me a question here.
please.
When you said Islamic abstract art, do you actually mean Islamic architecture? Because obviously in the work that you're doing, we see a lot of lines and curves and points, which are essential to Islamic architecture. Were you drawn into that, or was it actually painting, which if I'm in my mind, I'm thinking about modern Arab artists, which were probably not so abstract, but quite figurative. So what was the
No. Well, I knew in fact, my parents, because my father was a cultural attaché, we knew a lot of the Arab artists. In fact, the leading Iraqi artist, Jawad Salim, was one of my parents' best friends when I was in Baghdad as a small child. So I knew, and when we got to Nigeria, we knew all the great artists there. And I studied with Bruce Anabarpeya, who's still alive, and was declared a living treasure by UNESCO in 2008. My parents knew virtually all the cultural figures in Iraq, including the architects. But in terms of the art that would have an influence on me, as you say, Vincent, it was mostly the architecture.
Right.
For example, the mosque in Cairo, I think it's Ibn Tulun, is such a staggering piece of simple geometric form, creating a monumental presence in that city. And so those kinds of things stuck with me. The rest of it was of great interest to me, but it was the architecture that had the most influence on what would later become my own artistic style.
I believe in this room, you actually have a few examples of I mean, beyond obviously this monumental execution, I think you have another one which I would like for you to show us, because there's more curves in it and more sort of spiral in it. And I think it would be interesting for us to be introduced to that one as well. Although I do like what you have behind you, but we'll talk about this later, I know.
Yes, this tondo, which is the Western word for a circular canvas, comes from a design in northern India. The flanking buildings at the Taj Mahal, which of course were Islamic buildings, in the dome, in the interior, there are red glazed tiles that create a swirling effect similar to this, but they don't double up the way they do on my canvas. So I basically took, this will give you a sense of the process of adapting the influences. there is this magnificent red tile roof on the dome of the flanking buildings. And I took those swirls and regularized them, made them, in the original, they have a kind of handmade feel to them because of course it was all done by hand with ceramic tiles. So I regularized the swirls and then doubled them up in order to create more motion. In the dome, they wanted a sense of serenity. And I'm making more of a sense of energy here. And so it relates to—
Stephen? Is that a recent work? Is that recent?
This is from about 6 years ago. So it's relatively recent. And because they were so hard to make, a circular canvas is very hard to make. So I only did a few of these, but I'm quite proud of it. And
actually,
you
Stephen,
might want to—
Sorry, because I need to ask you this, because we were talking about your influence, your childhood and your influence, and you said that this painting was made 6 years ago. And of course, no disrespect here, but you are not exactly a young gentleman, I would say.
No.
And which means that there has been something happening between, let's say, the 20 years of your Arab Islamic influence, and obviously you're going to Harvard, and those last 10, 15 years probably that you've been making those incredible artwork. What made you do this, I would say, fairly recently at the scale of your lifetime and not before?
Well, early in life, I was so busy. The two big books, Pollock and Van Gogh, which we'll talk about, took 10 years apiece, and we worked 12 hours a day. My co-author, Greg Smith, and I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week on those two books. So there was no time for anything else. And then between those books, we had to make a living because writing biography doesn't pay for itself. Even if it sells well, as both of those two did, to cover two people working 10 years with research costs, and they were extremely expensive to write. So we started a company that ranked both doctors and lawyers. They've both been sold. They still exist. In fact, the doctor company now serves 30 million people around the world in finding doctors for complex and difficult illnesses. And so I'm very proud of those companies, but they also took a great deal of time, and they made it possible to write the books and also to form the art collection, which we'll also talk about. So it was really only about 15 or 20 years ago that I began to calm down enough that I could come back to the painting, which I always wanted to do, but never really had the freedom to do when I was so busy doing these other things, if that makes sense.
So Stephen, if I summarize for our viewers, you are an entrepreneur, you are a collector, and we'll talk about your collection in a minute. You're an author, you're a painter. Which is the one that you feel the most comfortable with? Is there one side of yourself that is maybe you more than any other sides?
Well, I actually feel connected. I mean, the least interesting part of my life was that of an entrepreneur. But even there, if you don't throw yourself into it, you can't be a success at it. So, I got very involved in trying to make those two companies a success. In terms of everything else, though, has always, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to live the life that I want to live and to pursue the activities that were most meaningful to me. So, I always wanted to be an artist from the time I was 9. I feel very lucky that I've been able to do that. I always wanted to write, and my co-author, Greg Smith, was just a brilliant prose stylist. So those were particularly satisfying because you can work, you basically do it on your own. I mean, eventually a publisher has to publish the book, but for a very long time, you're really working by yourself or with a co-author, and that was very satisfying. And the art collection and the house, so I started collecting art when I was 10, believe it or not. My parents knew I was a very odd child, and instead of a football or a baseball or the kind of, or tennis racket, what a child normally wants, I was asking them for art. And it wasn't necessarily very important, but it was important to me. And so eventually, thanks to those two entrepreneurial endeavors, I was able to start collecting art in a rather aggressive way and a very, very gratifying way. So all these things, I mean, the way I look at it is very few people get to do for a living what they want to do just for the fun of it. And I've been lucky enough to do that. I think that one of the things that can make for a happy life is getting up in the morning and looking forward to your work. And so I've had that good fortune, and I feel very lucky.
I mean, Stephen, you're a little bit hard on yourself when you say for the fun of it, because I think you're a pretty serious artist. I mean, obviously it's visually stunning, but you are collected in prime collections, in prime museums.
No, I don't know. I would think, some artists did not enjoy what they were doing. We'll talk about Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
He didn't, I mean, it was such a challenge to come up with a new image. I don't think you could say that he had fun making those paintings. But if you look at Picasso, for example, I mean, it was all joyful. I mean, he was so, I'm not going to compare myself to his quality, obviously, but in terms of the joy that he had from the experience of making a painting was overwhelming. He never struggled over it. I mean, there may have been challenges that he had to solve, but his whole life was one of joy. And so within the artistic continuum, you go all the way from Pollock on one end to Picasso on the other end. And I'm grateful that I actually look forward to making the art. I don't think of it with great angst. I don't, believe me, there is angst along the way. Sometimes an idea doesn't come to fruition. Sometimes the idea seemed like a better idea when you began than when you tried to adapt it into a full work of art. Sometimes the technical issues were complicated. And in the making of art, I was dependent on, as you'll see in a moment, on steel fabricators and carpenters and other people. And so there's the challenges of working with craftsmen and making sure they do as good a job as you want them to do. So I don't want to say that there was never any difficulty along the way, but even with the writing, there were difficulties along the way. But that didn't mean that I didn't get up every morning looking forward to the process.
Stephen, I would like to see more of your work, and particularly I know that in this room you have works that are related to the works that we can see in Abu Dhabi at the Cleveland Clinic, particularly your sort of tri-dimensional work, which I absolutely love, by the way. And I also would like, maybe in the course of your walking towards those works, that you maybe touch upon that a subject that you addressed in some of the lectures that you are doing, which is the connection between Islamic art and contemporary art. And we're not just talking about Frank Stella. I know that you have a piece on the floor, actually, that probably
right.
But I would love to hear your view on that.
Well, just as I was always interested in Islamic art, especially Islamic architecture, I also fell in love at a young age with Western abstraction. And the first book I wrote was my dissertation at Harvard, which was published as a book in 1982 on the Washington, D.C. color painter, Gene Davis, who did this painting here. And I think he's one of the great artists of the 20th century. His status isn't there for a lot of complex art world political reasons, but he was one of the great colorists of the 20th century. And this is a painting called Narcissus. It's the only symmetrical painting that he ever did. And he once said that the most efficient way to combine colors is in stripes, because you can put all these different colors on the canvas in a regimented and in an organized but artistic way. And he had a terrific color sense, but it is not as relevant to the Islamic side of my inspiration as a group of artists, another group of artists, including Frank Stella, who was sort of, for most boys, the idol is some sort of athletic hero. And for me, my idol when I was 12 years old, 14 years old, was Frank Stella. And the very first thing I bought as a collector was this print by Frank Stella. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that the image it derives from the shape of the canvas, meaning he started with that rectangle with the notches on all four sides and derived the sequencing of the of the stripes from those notches. And it created an image of enormous integrity because it's the image is so connected to the basic structure of the canvas. And of course, many of the Islamic work or inspired works that I do are also the image derives in many ways from the overall shape. And so I think Frank Stella, I later met him like 20 years ago, and he had read one of our books. So it was very gratifying to know that somebody who was so important to me spent 3 or 4 months reading a book that I wrote. It was on the one on Pollock, and Pollock had been very important to Frank Stella. Let me take you to one of the other works that I did, which, as you mentioned, is related to some of the works. It's wonderful knowing that there are 5 paintings and sculptures by me at the Cleveland Clinic, which is such a gorgeous building and such a fine medical facility. And there's one over the entrance that is, the series is called Saida, and there's a copper sculpture in the main foyer of the Cleveland Clinic, and then outdoors there's another sculpture in limestone. But all of them feature the sort of the squares that you would find in the original Islamic inspiration. But what I noticed was that the areas between the squares were these wonderful arrow shapes. So I decided that it created a different work of art if you constructed not the squares, which appear in the works at the Cleveland Clinic, but the areas in between those squares, these arrow shapes. And it also creates a much more lace-like work that breathes more, because it's this sort of explosion of smaller shapes around from the center outward. So and in some of the works, I combine both the solid and the open, as I call them. There's one like this in Kuwait, because I have multiple works in Abu Dhabi, including, I don't know, I guess I could say this, the Royal Collection there owns several, but I also have works in Dubai and in
yes.
Kuwait.
And the Jumeirah, yeah, Four Seasons.
Correct,
Four Seasons, absolutely, yeah.
And in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But there's because I have a close relationship to Abu Dhabi, there's a particularly nice group of works in that beautiful city. So that's
and Stephen, I know that you've been inspired not just by the lines and the points and the curves, but also by sand roses. And I've seen your work recently, and I know that you've got a piece in your library. So I think it would be great to also step into the library, because that will give us also a connection with your
the camera will go ahead of me, and I will follow and show you one of the works that are based on desert roses. As I'm sure most of you know, there are these ancient geological formations of sand that fuse in the heat and create these beautiful shapes. And I have a couple of small ones where I stack them. It turns out I'm not the only person who realized what the possibilities might be in using these as abstract forms, because Jean Nouvel, I believe it is, did a building and gutter that was based on desert roses. I'm particularly proud of the one that I was commissioned to do a monumental work for the Indiana University Art Museum, which is in an IMP building with a beautiful atrium that looks a little bit like the National Gallery in Washington, which he also designed. And there's a 14-foot sculpture in which these they sort of stack vertically, but they move in different directions as they go up the sculpture, and the whole thing sort of dances in space. And I'm very proud of that work as well. And these were essentially models for larger works, but I haven't constructed the larger works yet. One of the things I did that sort of made these very modern, even though they're based on these ancient, geological formations, is that these were constructed on a computer, and then they were 3D printed, actually in the Ukraine, which is rather, now that I think about it, which is rather pertinent. Yeah, these were made in the Ukraine, in a machine there. And so it was quite magical to go from a computer image that was made here to having them, literally my fingers, well, I can touch them now, but no human hands touch this thing during the actual process. Even the 14-foot one in Indiana was done by 3D printing, and at the time it was the largest 3D printed sculpture that had ever been done. I'm sure in the years since, this was about 4 years ago, others have come along that are even larger. But it's very gratifying to have an object that was based on Middle Eastern sources, because these desert roses occur in all the deserts of the world, but obviously in throughout the deserts of the Middle East, in a building that's so this wonderful building at the Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. So let me also say that one of the things that was sort of exciting was, as you could see from the metal piece down there, I couldn't construct that. I had to work with metal fabricators, and then the kind of operations that put chrome and copper, that plate basically steel. And I was working with craftsmen mostly here in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. And one of the things that was sort of exciting was that these people who really hadn't thought about the Muslim world very much, and who basically work on motorcycles and cars and things like that, were all of a sudden working on sculptures with me that were based on these millennium-old Islamic prototypes, and they got into it. They sort of liked the fact that they were working with something from a different culture and sort of broadening their horizons. And so that was certainly one of the one of the large sculptures is in Columbia in front of the museum there. This monumental sculpture, it's the main sculpture in front of the museum, and it comes from an Islamic design, and it's 2 blocks from the State House, the government center in the state that I live in. So within 2 blocks of the South Carolina State House is this huge Muslim sculpture, and I had an exhibition there, and there was a wonderful moment when a family, I think they were from Pakistan or India, came through, and they had 2 small children, and the parents were explaining to the 2 small children the Islamic origin of most of the art, and you could see the sort of pleasure they took in having their world represented in this Western museum. So, bringing these worlds together, and I think I got that from my father. When he was a cultural attaché, he would have exhibitions in all these countries that he served in, and had probably he set up the earliest art exhibitions in Abu Dhabi. This was in the early 70s. And in fact, some of them were at the Hilton Hotel because it was the only place you could hang anything. And so the connections that he made for American artists in the Middle East and then Middle Eastern artists in America was something that I grew up with. So, we all learn from our parents in ways that may not be completely obvious, but that are absolutely fundamental to who we are. And so I give my father a lot of credit for this.
Actually, Stephen, if you allow me, we're reaching now sort of a halftime of our talk today. Mm-hmm. The crazy part is it's not the end of your world. I mean, there's a lot more to discover. And what I was quite astonished with is, although you have a tremendous, obviously an influence, artistic influence from the Middle East, geometry, abstraction, and so on, you're also a collector and a writer. We'll talk about the writing side probably at the end of our talk, but I would like for us to maybe enjoy a little bit of your collection, because as probably no one in this room would imagine, you're not actually a abstraction collector. You're a collector of a very fine, I would say 19th, probably 19th, 18th century, rather classic European art. And I think this is really interesting about you, is you are going from, I would say, one end to another in artistic movements with great taste. And if you're okay, I mean, I would love for you to show us a little bit around and maybe explain why are you collecting this when you're interested so much in abstraction and Islamic art?
Well, I have collected some modern pieces, and when we finished the Pollock biography, I bought to celebrate the 6 silk screens that Jackson Pollock did in 1951. So there are, and I also, when I was 15 years old, my parents bought me a very important Jasper Johns print that's still, in fact, it was down in the gallery. So there are some modern works, but my interest isn't just in that. And as we were, by the time we started working on Van Gogh, there was enough money from the company to begin to collect. And so at the very time that we began to collect, our minds were completely involved in what Van Gogh was writing about, which was mostly the 19th century. And so we knew which artists he liked, and providentially, some of the artists he liked were well beyond our budget. Monet and Gauguin were not going to happen, and certainly Van Gogh wasn't going to happen. But there were many of the artists that he liked were affordable, and in fact, I've loaned them to multiple museums to form the basis of of exhibitions on Van Gogh and the artists who inspired him. Unfortunately, 70 of those paintings are in Ohio right now at an exhibition, so most of those paintings are not here. But we also, along the way, because one can in art especially, there's really no part of the world that hasn't created fantastic art. So the collection has some old master paintings. It has lots of carpets from the Middle East. It has some metalwork from the Middle East, jolly screens from northern India, quite a few Japanese screens, some Chinese painting in the scroll painting. But the bulk of it is 19th century. And let me take you right here. There is a painting by Kamenev, who was, if you've heard the phrase Barbizon School, the main landscape school in France that led to the Impressionist movement was called the Barbizon, and it influenced artists in other countries, including Holland and America and Russia. And Kamenev was one of the 2 most important landscape painters in Russia in the 1860s and 70s, and this is one of Kamenev's major paintings. There's also a focus on neoclassical sculpture.
But you have to admit, Stephen, if you allow me, now we're walking in your library, but you have to admit that Frank Stella and École de Barbizon together is quite an interesting clash. I mean, I'm sure it is. Isn't it?
It's, well, the problem is if you like everything, it's hard to settle down into one. I mean, I do in my own work because you can't scatter in your own artistic endeavor. But in terms of collecting, it's very hard. I mean, if I had the money, I would love to have an old master collection. This comes close. This is by Antonio Canova, his bust of Beatrice, who was Dante's lover. And it has this wonderful veil and these wonderful curls that Canova used. There are 3 examples of this. There's one in Venice in his studio. There's one in Boston, and then there's the one here. We have 2, we won't have time to look at them, but there are 2 monumental neoclassical sculptures as well. The art library is not insignificant, as you can imagine, because Greg and I wrote books. In fact, we can go in here briefly, and you can see all the foreign editions of Pollock and Van Gogh. There's Portuguese and Spanish and French and German and Dutch and Japanese and Korean and Chinese and Russian. And now there's a Vietnamese edition in the work. So I'm very proud that these books have been read all over the world. And in fact, I just published a book that's more of an art history book with lots more illustrations on Van Gogh and the artists who inspired him, a book that was essentially inspired by our collection. And now we're going to walk through. The house is very large. It was designed for the robber baron William Whitney, whose son married Gertrude Vanderbilt, who founded the Whitney Museum in New York. This was one of his 10 houses, and it was designed for him by the two major architects of the 19th century, Stanford White, who did the interiors of the White House, and by Carrere and Hastings, who did the Frick Museum in New York and the New York Public Library, as well as other major museums. This wonderful room was designed by Carrere and Hastings, and as was the foyer of the house. The house covers 25,000 square feet. It's quite massive. We wouldn't have been able to afford it if it had been outside a major city, but nobody wanted 25,000 square feet in Aiken, South Carolina. You can see how the architectural detailing is fabulous. And in addition to general 19th century art, there's a focus on neoclassical sculpture. There's also a focus on British portrait painting. And the greatest, it became an incredible force in European art in the late 18th century. But in the middle of the 19th century, the greatest portrait painter was John Linnell. And this was among his greatest portraits, if not the greatest. The subject is a man named William Conyngham, who was a member of parliament, a lawyer, and one of the founders of the National Gallery in London. He was an art collector. He owned Titian's and Gainsborough's. And he was a good friend of George Eliot, the woman who wrote Middlemarch. So it has this wonderful, the quality of light on his face, the quality, the sort of almost the fleshiness of the brushwork, which sort of leads into late 19th century art. Impressionism and post-impressionism are astonishing, and so I'm very. It's one of the treasures of the British portrait collection. And then a complete oddity is this triptych of Christ being lowered from the cross that was done in Antwerp in 1815, and there were a lot of sort of private devotional altarpieces that were made in Antwerp about that time. They were Mannerist in style, coming out of the Renaissance. You can see the elongation of the fingers in order to convey emotion that is sort of the hallmark of Mannerism. And among the people who bought a painting by this specific artist was Henry VIII of England for Hampton Court. So this came along, no one bought it. We were able to negotiate a very reasonable price and have lived with it very happily ever since. It was in perfect condition. And one of the things that's interesting is when people commissioned altarpieces for their private homes, obviously if they were wealthy, they would have the painter insert them in the religious drama. So this is the man who commissioned the altarpiece, and this is his wife with these elaborate gold-filled costumes, unlike the costumes of the people in the actual religious drama. Up here, I'll show you a drawing. There were 16 drawings done by a French artist named Charles Muller for the ceiling at the Salon de Nantes at the Louvre. And he takes these, we've been talking a lot about inspiration. The inspiration was Michelangelo. And you may see in that figure, for example, the similar nudes in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, only he's made them female. And those are now the full painted versions are now on the ceiling at the Salon de Nantes. My friend who's taking these pictures will pan through the salon. I will show you one more painting from the British portrait collection. And
Stephen,
it's this wonderful.
Can I ask you a question as a collector? I mean, I'm a collector myself, and in the room here attending this conference, we have a few collectors. What is the main reason for you to collect? I can tell that you love the story related to the artwork as much as
I think
you like stories.
I think in fact, there's a sentence in the new book that says that art is about appreciation, but it's also about possession. When I walk through a museum, one of the tricks or sort of games I play is if I could buy just one painting in this museum gallery, which one would it be? And I know there are other people who do that same thing. I know Philippe de Montebello, the former director of the Metropolitan, that was how he would look at art. He would go through every room in every museum and think which one he would take home if he could. So, and it never really occurred to me that I would be able to buy works of this caliber. So there is something about, first of all, I wanted to collect, I think I said earlier, from the time I was 15 years old, or actually 10. And my first work of art entered the collection when I was 10. And so it goes deep. I went to a museum in Paris when I was 9, which is the first one I remember. And I think right from the beginning, I must have wanted to take something home. So it goes very deep. And to be able to live with these things, as you know, as a collector, and some of the other people in the room as collectors know, that it's very different from looking at something in a museum and having it on your own walls where you can see it in different times of day, in different light, in different, and it becomes part of you in a way that's not entirely possible when you're just seeing it on the walls of a museum. Does that answer reasonably?
Yeah. Yes, but actually I wanted to, I mean, I'm trying to be smart here. I'm trying to get the link with your author side of your character as well. I think there's, in a way, I'm trying to understand the link between the different persona of Stephen.
Unfortunately, there is one painting in the small dining room over the fireplace that's by an artist that was important to, just to quickly, this is the wedding portrait of a woman named Dorothy Hodges by Joseph Wright of Derby. It's so charming with her pearls in her hair and the lace. The husband's portrait is at the National Gallery in Scotland. But unfortunately, most of the works in the collection that were by artists who inspired Vincent are off in this exhibition in Ohio. But there is, we own 6 paintings by Georges Michel, who was particularly influential to Van Gogh. So I'm going to ask Scott to go into the small dining room and show you the painting of by Georges Michel, who was essentially the father of the Barbizon School. He painted from 1790 to 1840, and Van Gogh, especially before, I mean, later he adds color, but the early, Van Gogh's career lasted 10 years, and the early paintings were monochromatic. They looked pretty much like this. But one thing that you can see that it still stays with him through the end of the career are these marvelous turbulent clouds, which he makes slightly more abstract, but clouds were one thing that could be very abstract. Even, artists who worked earlier than Van Gogh, you found in clouds a subject matter for abstraction that was quite early. And you can see the windmill here. This was painted in Montmartre about 1830. And so we began with paintings like this. This is one of the first things that entered the collection that did influence Van Gogh. But then we broadened out. You begin to notice that there are other artists from the same century that are by artists who were huge figures in their own time, but who are not on the among the artists that very wealthy collectors are currently buying in large numbers, and therefore they become sort of affordable. I'm going to go upstairs to my own computer. Is there anything else, Vincent, that we should cover?
Well, there's so much, but we've got 10 minutes left, and I really want you to start addressing particularly the books that you wrote. I mean,
let me go to my
these ambitious.
Let me go to my office while Scott pans around the living room here, the salon.
Can you still hear us, Stephen?
Yes, I can. I'm almost at my computer.
I'm going to try and figure out where you are. Yes, you are here. I'm going to put you on the main screen. Can you unmute yourself on the computer? Sorry, I'm Just going to do that. Barbara, est-ce que tu as la main pour activer le son de...
Non, je peux l'inviter à se réactiver, mais c'est à lui de le faire.
Can you unmute yourself, Stephen?
Yeah, there we are.
Ah,
Can you hear
perfect.
me?
Stephen.
Okay, well, folks, thank you. I know it was a little complicated because I was moving around the house, and but I do want to talk about the books because they were so central. You know, when Greg and I met in law school, and I realized early on that thank you so much, Gogh. I realized early on that he was an unbelievable writer. And in fact, as a summer intern at a law firm in San Francisco, they immediately had him writing briefs for the United States Supreme Court as a 22-year-old. That's how, and we both thought, what a waste to spend your time writing briefs for 9 people when you could write books for lots of people. And I was a big biography fan, and I had studied a lot of art history and had done my master's paper at Harvard on Jackson Pollock. And I realized that Jackson Pollock, well, first of all, at the time, there were great biographies of writers and of political figures and of military figures, but not artists. Since then, it's filled in. Partly, I would this doesn't sound very humble, but I think the Pollock and Van Gogh biographies inspired other people to write really good biographies of artists. I think it's partly because the skill set in writing about paintings or sculptures is quite different from the skill set of telling a story. And so we tried to apply the lessons of literary, military, political biography to artists. And Pollock was the ideal artist to begin with for a couple of reasons. One, he led this incredibly interesting life. Two, he was very important. He influenced a whole, the entire generation after him. And no one had ever done a major biography of Pollock, despite all that. And the material was available. It wasn't on paper yet, but because Pollock was born in the first, Pollock would have been about 75 when we began work. So even though he died relatively young, almost everybody in his life was still alive. Even his widow, Lee Krasner, was alive. His four brothers were alive. Their wives were alive. Most of his friends were alive. So it meant that we could go and interview all those people. So we interviewed 800 people. And it was like archaeology, because you were constantly digging. Only it was like an archaeologist who's constantly finding something, because there was all this interesting material that had never been on the page of a book. And it allowed us to reconstruct Pollock's life. And it was a little hard in some ways, because he was not a verbal person. He wasn't a reader. And he wasn't articulate in the way that we think people can be articulate. He was brilliant. But I talked to several of his psychiatrists. I don't know how I got past the doctor-patient confidentiality, but we did. And a woman who was 95 in Switzerland, who had been one of the psychiatrists, said, "You're not going to be able to understand this at first, but you can be really brilliant and not at all verbal." So one of the challenges was reconstructing what was going on in his mind, even though there wasn't a lot that was in, he had rarely discussed his ideas with other people. So we had to sort of triangulate what was probably going on in his mind, both from the art and from what he did tell other people, and from what they assumed he was thinking and doing in the case of Lee Krasner and other people who were very close to him. Then when that was finished, and it got a very good reception, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was a bestseller, and people liked it a lot. So we eventually wanted to do another artist, and the question became who. It needed to satisfy all the criteria that Pollock satisfied. It needed to be somebody who was very important, whose life was intensely interesting, who had influenced the artists coming after him, about whom no major biography had ever been written, and for whom material was available. And Van Gogh was ideal on all those levels. It was hard for us to imagine that an artist as significant as Vincent van Gogh had never had a major biography written about him. And there were two challenges. I mentioned earlier in the gallery that you can approach every day with joy, even though there are challenges to be met. One of them was that we didn't speak Dutch. So the source materials were in Dutch. We had 11 translators helping us with that project. So I would sit down with them and they would give me the topic sentences of paragraphs, and we would decide what needed to be translated and what didn't need to be translated. So we translated a great deal of material. The other problem, at least at the front end, we thought, was that it was all in books. I mean, there was actually a woman who's lived longer than any other recorded person who had met Van Gogh when she was a child, who was still alive when we began our book. But she didn't remember him, and I don't know how I would have contacted her. So basically, it was all there, and the question was, are we going to find anything new? And and surprisingly, we did. Partly because art historians are not interested in the life story in the way that they're interested in the art. So we would see things because we were looking for both the art and the life story that other people hadn't seen. For example, we found that he very likely was going to have a child with his next door neighbor, and they rushed her off to Utrecht for what we think was an abortion. But he did, we think, have a child with a peasant woman in Noonan. And the people at Van Gogh Museum were aware of that. They'd never printed it, but they were aware of that one. The biggest discovery was that Van Gogh probably didn't kill himself. And it's a long story of how we got to that information, but it appears increasingly unlikely. And interestingly, the two movies that came out about him, some of you may have seen At Eternity's Gate with Willem Dafoe. Julian Schnabel, the artist who made that film, filmed it using our narrative of the end of Van Gogh's life. So in addition to being able, and with Van Gogh, unlike with Pollock, Van Gogh was incredibly articulate, and he wrote so much. His letters to Theo would be a major accomplishment of world culture, even if he had never been a painter. They're so great, and there's over 700 of them. And with him, as with Pollock, the family letters are mostly about Vincent, not because he's the famous artist, but because he was the problem in the family. All of the Van Gogh family letters, or many of them, are about what can we do with Jackson? He's such a mess. How are we going to get him off alcohol, and how are we going to straighten out his life? And with Van Gogh, they were worried that he was mentally ill, and they knew that he couldn't make any money, and that he couldn't make a relationship, and that he had no friends. And so they're constantly writing back and forth about the problems in Van Gogh's life. But in his own letters, he talks about those problems, but he also talks about art in wonderful ways, in incredibly articulate ways about what he loved and about what he saw in paintings. So with Van Gogh, even more than with Pollock, we were able to get inside his head in a very exciting way, if that makes sense.
And I want to ask you something, because of course, I mean, obviously Europeans are probably a bit more familiar with the history of the life of Van Gogh than the life of Pollock. But there's a lot of stories around Van Gogh, and I'm actually interested in your almost forensic research that you did on Van Gogh, and to try to segregate the stories that were told around his life, his tragic life, his sort of post-death success, etc., and the reality of the situation, which is kind of question marked at every stage. I mean, you said it yourself. You put up a narrative on the end of his life, and it is obviously speculative, but it's probably true what you wrote. I mean, I read, unfortunately, I have not yet read your book. I ordered it, by the way. But how do you differentiate? You said archaeology work, probably forensic techniques. How do you work on that?
Well, I think one of the benefits here, you mentioned earlier that we've had all these different personas, including lawyers. And Greg was a better lawyer than I am. He also wrote better than I do, but he was a better lawyer than I am. And which part of that, being a good lawyer, is being very skeptical of not taking the information that you see at face value, because somebody may find another piece of information. And if a judge asks you about it, you better have an answer. So you need to read. You just can't take the information you're given as the truth. You need to think through very carefully what you're reading and challenge it before you accept it. And that's not something art historians do as much. So when we would read something, just because Van Gogh said it, didn't mean it was true. You know, we found early on that he had a purpose in writing those letters to Theo, beyond telling the truth. There were two purposes. One was to maintain an emotional contact and to try to make Theo love him. The other purpose was to try to get more money from Theo. So he was constantly weaving these elaborate arguments that may or may not have been entirely accurate in order to convince Theo, who had a lot of pressures on him financially, he was supporting eventually his wife and his child, but also their mother and one of his sisters and Vincent. And he was just making a salary as a art gallerist. So Vincent was constantly telling Theo things to convince him to send more money. So right from the beginning, we didn't take, and there were other artists around Vincent. Emile Bernard is a good example, who just lied constantly. You know, they're constantly telling a better story. But this happened with Pollock. This is one of the more interesting examples, is in the movie. If you've seen the movie Pollock, the best scene, I think, is where he unfurls the canvas, the white canvas, and then it goes to a blank screen, and you see Pollock trying to imagine what he's going to put on this huge canvas, and then all of a sudden he paints it basically overnight. Well, our source for that narrative was Lee Krasner, his wife. She was in the apartment when he was doing the painting. It seemed like an incredibly good, accurate source. But recently, the painting went to the Getty Museum, where it was conserved, where it was cleaned. And while they were there, they took core samples of the paint, where they can scientifically evaluate which color was added and which paint was added on top of which paint. And when they're doing that, they can come up with a very accurate timeline of when the paint was applied. And they came away from that scientifically knowing that Pollock painted that over a much longer period of time. Now, I don't think Lee Krasner was quote unquote lying. She was just telling a better story. It was a much better story that he didn't know what to do. Then he finally got an idea and he painted it overnight, than to say he had trouble figuring out what to paint. And then, you know, he finally started, and, you know, 2 or 3 months later, he had a great painting. So, you know, you don't always get it right. That's why you have to, I mean, unfortunately, the Getty analysis happened 15 years after the book came out. You know, we would have to tell that story very differently. And the same thing is true with Van Gogh. Just because Emile Bernard recorded what Theo believed, which was that Van Gogh had shot himself, you know, at a certain point. I mean, I can go into that problem that in the research, but it became very clear to us that there were some real problems with the traditional story, and then the alternate and more likely story emerged from the material, and then we sent it to the kinds of experts who decide whether something was a homicide or suicide. There are people who specialize in that forensically, and they were unanimous in saying that Van Gogh could not have killed himself under the circumstances. So ironically, we went in to write about an artist where we thought there was no information of consequence that we could learn that hadn't been known, and that mostly we would just be combining the information that was known in a more interesting and more complete way. But it turns out there was information even about a man who lived, you know, 135 years ago, who that had not yet been discovered.
Stephen, I have a question, and I apologize because I have not read these two books, although I ordered them. And so I apologize if this answer is already in your book, but I think it would be very interesting. These two examples are fascinating because Pollock was considered as the greatest painter in America. I think that was the title in, I think it was Newsweek, who celebrated him as the greatest painter in America during his lifetime. Whereas Van Gogh was only discovered, I would say, later than that. Now, these are two interesting phenomena because we can always argue whether Jackson Pollock was actually the greatest painter in America. That's a question mark. I mean, I have this question myself. Van Gogh, that's even more curious because he was almost completely ignored during his lifetime, and then extremely celebrated, I would say 10 years after his death or something like that, 10, 15 years after his life. Did you explain that? Can you explain those two phenomena, if they can be explained, by the way?
Well, the interesting thing is, what does it do to the artist to be recognized or not recognized?
Exactly.
And with Pollock, it actually hurt him. It was in Life magazine that Clement Greenberg was quoted saying, he put it in a question form, but it was really a rhetorical question. Is Pollock the greatest living artist in America? And it had a devastating effect on Pollock because all of a sudden he had to live up to this reputation, and it made it more and more difficult for him to make new work. So he had a hard time with that. With Van Gogh, you have the very different situation, as you mentioned, that no one cared. Even Theo didn't really think much of this art because it all looks very normal to us because we've lived with it our whole lives. But if you were Theo Van Gogh in 1885, it just looked weird. The colors didn't look like anything anybody else had ever used. The method of drawing looked much more childlike, and we realized that childlike quality was really expressionist and would have a huge effect on the rest of the next decades of art. But actually, Van Gogh did begin to become famous just before he died. There was a young symbolist writer named Aurier who 6 months before Van Gogh died published an article that said almost what Greenberg had said about Pollock. It said, the greatest living artist is living in an insane asylum in the south of France, and you've never heard his name. And it was this long article that was a little overwritten, but all of a sudden Van Gogh, who's sitting in an insane asylum all alone with nobody looking at his work, and even the attendants at the insane asylum thinking it's just one more aspect of his craziness. And all of a sudden, somebody important in Paris is saying that he's the greatest artist. And then his brother Theo was able to get a few paintings into a major exhibition in Brussels. And among the artists who said this guy should be looked at more carefully were the Belgian master Van Rysselberg, but also Claude Monet and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. So people, even just before he died, and Van Gogh had the same reaction to this just glimmer of fame at the end of his life that Pollock had earlier in his life, and that was he didn't know how to handle it because he had convinced himself that that his lack of success was crucial to the psychology of his art, meaning that if he was successful, it would become much more difficult because he'd be constantly looking over his shoulder and thinking, what is someone going to say about this new thing that I've done or that new thing that I've done? And then all of a sudden, he is getting some attention. And so he went from being distraught over the fact that nobody cared to being distraught that people are now looking at him. And but he continued to paint. Unlike Pollock, one of the reasons we questioned the death is by suicide is that his last 70 days in Auvers were among the most prolific of his life. I realize I should be looking at the camera and not sure, so I don't know that I've been looking appropriately here. But he painted 70 paintings in 70 days in Auvers, and some of them are among the best things he ever painted. So one of the Pollock's life the end of his life is sad because he was so miserable, but he had almost stopped painting. Whereas with Van Gogh, he was painting some of his most interesting paintings there at the end of his life, and he was so young, he was in his 30s, we're left to wonder, what if he'd lived to be 40 or 50? Because most of the paintings we know were painted in the last 4 years of his life. What if he'd had another 20 years? Because it was becoming more abstract. Would it have gone to full abstraction? Maybe. So it was really sad to have his life cut short.
Stephen, we're unfortunately arriving at the end, at least of let's say the regular time. You're a fascinating character, and quite clearly, I would have loved to interview you for 3 hours rather than just one. You have so much to say, but I would love for the audience to maybe ask some questions. I think you were kind enough to accept to stay a little longer than their regular time. So perhaps, Barbara, would you like to sort of take over the mic and maybe let some of our viewers ask a few questions? I mean, you're obviously a fascinating character, so I'm sure there will be several persona that we would like to ask questions to. Barbara, I'll leave you the floor. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vincent. Yeah, it was really fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Stephen, for this amazing visit of your house and the collection. We are very, very lucky to have this possibility to do that with you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm lucky that you invited me. I'm very grateful, and I'm very pleased that we were able to set this up.
Thank you so much. So kind of you. I will leave Lina. Lina has a question. So Lina, do you want to ask your question?
I'm mute. Yes. Hi, Stephen. Thank you very, very much. You're such an interesting person. I mean, in every respect. I just want to ask you this question that I wrote on the chat. Like, we know that the more tormented the soul is of the painter, of the artist, the more probably his his prices increase. You know, the more we know most of the painters that are very expensive have kind of a very weird persona. So my question is, homicide as opposed to suicide. Do you think that it affected his price? Like, if now we can prove that it was actually homicide, does the prices of his paintings, will it go down? Will they go down?
No. Your point is an excellent one, and that is I think let me put it this way. One of the reasons that both Pollock and Van Gogh achieved the fame that they did was because their life stories were so interesting, especially with Van Gogh. You know, the novel Lust for Life comes out in the 1930s, and then the movie with Kirk Douglas comes out in 1956. Even though neither one captured the real torment of his life, you know, they did show the suicide, and then the ear incident alone is enough to convince people that you don't have to know much more to realize that he was not a happy person. And I do think it helped make him a lot more famous, and therefore probably contributed. But there's something related to the torment that's also significant and interesting, and that is the paintings are not tormented. Interestingly, the life is tormented, but the paintings, if you think about the sunflowers, there's nothing tormented about it. And I think one of the reasons that people love the art is that we all realize without thinking about it, sense that this tormented guy made all this jubilant, joyful work. And it creates an almost, Greg and I always thought there was a kind of almost religious message that in fact, Van Gogh was aware of this. His favorite passage from the Bible was sorrowful, but always rejoicing, which he quoted it over and over and over again. So that out of this great sorrow, he created all this joy. And I think that helped cement him as probably the most popular artist in the world. I think it's a fair, I don't know who challenges that status. I mean, there are other great artists like Rembrandt and Michelangelo and whoever, but they are not as popular. It's all these immersive experiences, all of them virtually, are about Van Gogh. There's one on Monet and there's one coming up on Frida Kahlo, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens about Van Gogh. So I do think it helped his reputation and therefore his prices. The prices in the art market today, especially at the highest levels, are so the art market has become has commodified art, and therefore I think in a way that torment and an interesting personal narrative affected the prices along 40 years ago. Now there are dealers and collectors who have an interest in developing the reputation of an artist that may or may not reflect any torment in the artist's life. And I'll give you an example. Warhol actually had a pretty terrible life for much of it, and but I don't think that people really know that. So I don't know the prices. And then you take a painter like Jeff Koons. It's been a easy life. He has all the money in the world. He collects art. He makes all this stuff, and
his muse is a prostitute. So.
Pardon me?
His muse is a prostitute.
His muse was a prostitute. So yeah, he had a very happy life. So I think your point was more accurate before the whole sort of art world establishment began to shape price structure than it does now, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hoda has a question for you, Stephen.
Sure.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much. It was such an interesting presentation. I really enjoyed. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
I have a question. When I listened to you, you reminded me of Gibran Khalil Gibran, an artist, a writer, and all this. Do you have, by any chance, any artwork for Gibran Khalil Gibran?
Well, because my grandmother was from Lebanon, you know, it was in the background at all times, but I'm not an expert. I should be, but I wish I was more of an expert than I am. And let me just say I should spend more time reading his poetry and his writings.
And the painting also. He has beautiful paintings
and
too.
the paintings too.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
we did have, my parents, because my father loved art so much, there was always a lot of Islamic art in the house. There wasn't a Gibran. We had two wonderful Jawad Salims and works by other Middle Eastern artists, and a lot of, my father loved metalwork. He loved, you know, brass, and we didn't have much money because they were government servants, but you know, so it's not important, it's not museum worthy, but you know, he loved it and I loved it, and he did show a lot of the local artists, so I got to know them through the shows that he put on in the various countries that he served in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that Hannah has a question. Are you there, Hannah?
Yes. Hello, good evening. Thank you so much. This is amazing, really. My question is, every painting has a story behind it. Is it fair for Western art to judge Islamic or Middle Eastern artists, or vice versa like this?
Well,
their criteria.
It's a good question, and the fact is, I think what it points up is that the deeper you get to know a work, the more you can see in it, and the more profound it can be. So but I think that would apply to any art, meaning that the more time you spend getting to know what the artist was trying to achieve and what the range of the artist's work was, and where the specific work that you're looking at falls into the spectrum of the artist's creativity, and how that creativity falls into the context of the art around it, the more profound it is. So to your point, you know, someone who doesn't really, I think it helps to know Van Gogh's story, to look at the paintings, but it doesn't mean you can't enjoy them without knowing the story. You know, the colors are still there, the paint work, the brush work is still there, the joy is still there, even if you don't know as much as you could know about it. And the same would apply to Middle Eastern artists, where it certainly helps to know. I think if, you know, a Westerner who doesn't know anything about Middle Eastern art probably doesn't quite know how to place it, but that doesn't mean that they can't enjoy it in any way. I think they, you know, they still bring, I think we all bring a kind of universal understanding of form and of overt subject matter and of color and of brushwork that is really universal, that can approach. But for instance, let's use the example of Arabic calligraphy. You know, most Westerners don't know the place of the Arabic language in Middle Eastern culture. You know, because English doesn't have the same importance in America that I think Arabic does in the Arab world, because it was sort of the central cultural expression for so many years. And if you don't know how the calligraphy and relates to other calligraphers' work, then you're not seeing it fully. But that doesn't mean, I think, that you can't enjoy it just by looking at it itself. You can see the energy, you can see the harmony, You can see the boldness. I mean, there are things that you can see, even if you can't see it as fully as you would if you knew the place of calligraphy in Arab and Muslim culture. And so I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It does, especially because you have joined the two words together. Would I be able to call you émigré? Are you an émigré? Yes. Are you?
Well, I mean, you know, my mother, who was born in China, often says that we have no home because every place you were was home. My parents moved 48 times during their marriage. 48. They set up households 48 times, because even in Abu Dhabi, they lived in 3 different places because, you know, often my father was the first person to occupy a job. So they'd have a temporary place, then they'd have a less temporary place, then they'd have the semi-permanent place, and then we'd move to a different country. So they were, so as my mom said, I never had a feeling that I was not at home because we moved.
Oh my God.
The minute you opened your bag and took out your clothing and put it in the chest of drawers, that was home. So whether we were in Beta, Libya, or Abu Dhabi, or Karachi, Pakistan, or Minneapolis, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, or wherever we were, it was always home. So
will you choose yourself to write your own biography?
Well, I don't think I, unfortunately, would meet the standards I set for Pollock and Van Gogh. You know, people, unless, I mean, there are people who are really great writers, you know, like Joan Didion, who lost her husband and her daughter in the same year, wrote a very profound, moving memoir of that terrible year of her life. But you know, one thing we realized in writing about Van Gogh and Pollock, and one reason we were so lucky to write about these central figures, is you have to be very significant for people to want to take off, you know, even a week, let alone a couple of months to read about your life. And fortunately, actually, I hope this will answer the question too. We were constantly finding out things about these two families, especially in the case of the Pollocks. We found out things that this family did not know. His oldest brother was born out of wedlock. He didn't know that his parents got married after he was born. So there I am, he's 95 years old, and I felt a need, because I was young and bolder than I am now, to sort of say, you know, you might not know this, but your parents didn't get married until this date on the way to Wyoming, and you were born earlier in Denver. And he just thought it was sort of amusing at that point in his life. But we realized you uncover so much about somebody's life, some of which they might not have wanted repeated. I'll give you an example. Because the Pollock family was still alive, when the four of the brothers were still alive when the book came out, they were horrified by some of the material in the book. For instance, interestingly, the book is not altogether flattering about the mother. We thought it was flattering about the father, but we talk at length about the fact that he was an alcoholic, which was not insignificant in understanding that Jackson was an alcoholic. Well, the brothers, who didn't know their father all that well, were horrified to see in print that he was an alcoholic. Well, we knew, I mean, the data was absolutely clear. So my point is, Greg and I used to say to each other, thank God we're not important enough for anybody to ever do to us what we're doing with Jackson Pollock. You know, the fact that we found out that it was inevitable in a way, but we found multiple people telling us that he beat Lee Krasner, you know, that he hit her occasionally. He was drunk and he was an angry guy. And you know, I'm not sure either one of them would have wanted to see that in print. But luckily, they had no children. They were both dead when the book came out. And it was important in understanding just how bad the marriage got to know that it got physically abusive. But again, I don't know what the secrets of my life are, but I'm not sure I want them out there.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm sorry, because everything you say is so interesting, but we are getting a bit late. I would like to give the floor to Asma for the last question.
Hi, Mr. Stephen. Thank you very much to all and your home. And we give us the beautiful journey from your soul first and connect between East and West, and also for beautiful home and luxury house. I want to ask you my question because you the writer side. When you write your book, because I know it's take time, but how long it take the research to finish your book?
How much time did it take, or how much effort went into it?
To finish your you have to finish your book, you know, as you make a Bangkok and Jean Pollock.
They took both of them were. I did the research for Pollock in about 6 years, but again, that was working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, because we had to make sure we read everything that had been published about him, and I had to engage in all those interviews, and then we had to transcribe all those interviews. So it was and then we had to take that material and break it down into segments that could then be reassembled into a narrative, because one interview could generate material that would appear in 40 different places in the biography. In Van Gogh's case, it was even more challenging, because even though there were no interviews to be done, there was a much bigger literature on him. There was a huge literature. So reading that literature, luckily in college, one of the things I learned to do was to speed read. So because we not only had to read the literature on Van Gogh and read what he wrote, although Greg's made his primary task reading those letters, he spent 3 years, 12 hours a day, reading those letters the way a religious scholar would read a religious text. I mean, he was looking at every single word and trying to understand it profoundly. But we also had to read what Van Gogh had read. And Van Gogh was such a heavy reader, both of poetry and of literature, and to some extent articles, but in 4 languages, German, French, English, and Dutch, that I had to read 3 books a day for 3 years just to read what he read. Wow. And then I had to make notes on it and convey that in a way that we could use it. So, but we talked about the joy of all this. I can't tell you how exciting it was to wake up every morning and have the 3 books I'd set out, knowing I had to finish all 3 that day. But I was not reading them word for word. Obviously, I was reading for those things that would help us understand Van Gogh and what he would find interesting in them and how they might have advanced his thinking both about art and life and about literature. So Van Gogh, the research went even longer. Van Gogh, the research was about 8 years. But the hard part was also storing all that information. When we ended up with 100,000 note cards for Van Gogh. With Pollock, we did them on paper, but for Van Gogh, we had some software engineers create a software that allowed us to use digital cards and to pull, so you didn't have to go out there and find the card in some distant notebook. It was all in a computer, and we could create an outline, and then we could just move the cards digitally into the outline. I think it would have added years and years to the process if we hadn't been able to work on a single computer screen and had to resort to accessing the information in notebooks all over the place. So I hope that gives you some sense of, but it was so exciting because you would read those books.
Yeah, we read this book. Thank you. You give me a present when you come my home. I'm lucky to have your book and we read it. But if you want to write about any Middle East art biography for artists, did you choose anyone in your mind? It's from your experience to this or travel or Asia?
It's really hard. We after finishing Pollock, we really couldn't come up with a single American artist that was worthy of that big a treatment. Yes. There were artists who were that important, but the lives maybe weren't interesting enough, or there wasn't enough information, or the influence. So, I feel very lucky that the 20 years we spent on the 2 books were spent on artists who met all of those criteria. It's really hard. I mean, Picasso would have met it, but among Middle Eastern artists, I don't know which one or the other would capture a 10-year experience. And And that's my ignorance. I'm sure there are Japanese artists who led fascinating lives. I don't know the Arab artists well enough to know whose life was compelling enough and was connected enough to because not only does the life have to be interesting and the art great, but to really justify a biography, there has to be a link between the life and the art. It can't just be the life for its own sake. It has to be the life as it potentially influenced the creation of art. So I know of a Latin American artist who had an incredibly interesting life. She was orphaned and was basically lived on her own under terrible circumstances, and then was put in an orphanage and treated badly. And she lost her first child in a war. I mean, she had this incredible life, but I'm not sure the art was interesting enough to justify the connection between the art and the life. So at this point, it's really sad that I'm not going to undertake another book on that scale, partly because Greg's gone. He died of a brain tumor that he had for his whole life. He had a brain tumor. He had 13 brain operations. Wow. Can you imagine 13 brain operations? And he often worked from a hospital bed. And he had the brain tumor when he was 22, and he finally died at 62. So he survived it with all that medical care for 40 years. And we're lucky that he survived both Pollock and Van Gogh. But without him to work with, and I'm also getting old, as Vincent mentioned, I think it was, I'm almost 70. And so I'd be 80 before I finished a 10-year project. And let me just say the mind is not getting better. It's not getting more agile. So
I apologize, Stephen, for meaning something
I'm fine,
I didn't.
Believe me, every time I look at myself, I realize how old I am. This is not, you can't hide it from yourself. But I'm very lucky. My mother, who loved Abu Dhabi, my parents both loved it. My mother we had an apartment right on the Corniche, and we could see the water from the apartment. It was just a lovely place. It wasn't a grand apartment or anything, but the view was fantastic. And she loved teaching her Abu Dhabi girls at Mar. And she's 93, still joyful. And because of the pandemic, she moved into the house. And so she wanted me to, in case there's anybody in the group who went to Mar in the mid 70s when she was there, she wanted me to say hello. And I'm very lucky that she's still alive and still doing so well.
That's good.
No, we have to hear, inshallah, in this, because she teach me English. That's why we have in Arabic. Yes, we have. We have in Arabic an Arabic word. من علمني حرفا صرت له عبدا. يعني always we follow our teacher who teach us a single word. يعني. Thank you for your.
She loved you girls. I mean, she talks about it over and over. She tells stories about, for instance, that when she first arrived, everybody was horrified that she spoke American English and not English, and they were afraid it was going to hurt them on their exams. But she, as she always did, she made close friends with people, as you presumably know. And anyway, so she told me to please say hello to everybody there.
Thank you for Barbara. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you to be with us.
And Stephen, thank you so much, but unfortunately, everything has an end. Right. So thank you so much for opening the doors of your amazing house and collection. As we just discussed about it, having lived in the region, you have a lot in common with many of us. I have, of course, been particularly touched by your knowledge, your expertise, your kindness, and of course, by the quality and beauty of your art. So we hope that we will have the pleasure to host you very, very soon in Abu Dhabi. You see, everybody's waiting for you here. So we hope that you will come soon. Also, please, a special thank you to Scott, who did a great job in working as a.
By the way, he's an artist, and that painting behind me is by Scott.
Oh, okay. Because we made him do something very important tonight, but he's a great artist also.
Yes, no, it's he's very modest about it, but he's a very accomplished artist. And anyway, thank you all for inviting me. It was a great pleasure, and I'm very grateful. And the whole thing was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you for an amazing presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Take care.
Thank you, Vincent, for another great moderation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, everyone.
See you soon.